In this fourth and last talk, I want to cover the subject of consumption and technology, and then some final reflections. The framework now, the first talk was about the 18th century framework of how you produce wealth, the second, how you distribute wealth in the 19th century view, the 20th century view of how you exchange wealth in the last talk, and now how you consume wealth, the 21st century obsession with consumption. And to start this off and to link it with the previous talk, I want to first look at the question of money, which is so central to our lives. What is money? Well, money is a trick. It's a fiction. It's a symbol which has no intrinsic value. Gold, silver, jewels, bits of paper or cowrie shells are in themselves useless and valueless, obviously. Value is injected into them by human beings. This explains why almost anything can be used as money. At school, money, when I was a small boy, was sometimes marbles, sometimes white mice, sometimes sweets. In many parts of Asia, tea blocks of tea, are still used as money. They are in many ways a good form of money, since if you're hard pressed in the middle of the Gobi Desert, you can always consume the money by drinking it. In other societies, salt, pepper or spices are used, as is precious incense. Elsewhere it's shells or stones. Many of these items, as I mentioned, have no intrinsic value at all, but we give them value because of their scarcity. So what are the types of money? Well, the economic anthropologist Dalton drew a clear distinction between what he called general purpose money and limited purpose money. The latter is much more common in pre-industrial societies. Limited purpose money doesn't have all the functions and is technically, in forms of true absolute money, deficient compared with coins and with paper. We're told that in terms of divisibility, portability, and what is called fungibility, Fungibility, which means basically the ability to exchange between things, exchange a sack of grain for a pile of corns, a pile of coins maybe makes something fungible, so you can exchange any way you like. In those terms, limited purpose money often is rather defective. For example, there's been a famous study of the Russell Islanders, that's R-O-S-S-E-L, Islanders, who had a sophisticated shell currency system in which shells had numbers, with the higher number having the greater value. But the fact that it was not possible to convert a large quantity of low-value shells for one of higher value meant that this money was lacking one of the fundamental features of general purpose money. You couldn't take lots of 5p coins or a cent and exchange it for higher denominations. The anthropologist Bohannon describes how among the Nigerian Tiv in the later colonial period, quote, the Tiv used iron bars to facilitate the exchange of a range of luxury goods, including tobacco, cattle and slaves. However, it was not appropriate to use this currency either for the purchase of subsistence goods or for the acquisition of wives. So you can only use money in certain spheres. There are spheres where you can use one kind of money, other spheres where you can use other kinds. And this is, to a certain extent, our experience in our own society now. So what are the effects of money? Well, money stands for a relation of power over other people. It's like oil in a machine, and it allows the parts to function without grinding against each other in a complex economy. It's a translation device, in other words, a leveler. It makes objects in different spheres exchangeable. It allows us to create one commodity and then to exchange these for others. It has no morality in itself, no inner essence, but it can enter into all parts of our lives. We do try to protect areas from money, as I mentioned in the last talk, even in capitalist societies, and say no money here. certain beautiful things are beyond the reach of money. For instance, I can't sell a part of King's College Chapel, which in a sense I am a trustee of, or I am a trustee of as a fellow of the college, but I can't sell any of it off. I cannot buy or sell true love or friendship. I cannot buy or sell truth or religious salvation, even though the Catholic Church to a certain extent does allow people to buy their way to salvation through the system of indulgences and candles and so on. I cannot buy part of the public park in the centre of Cambridge. I cannot buy a place in a cricket team if I'm absolutely useless at cricket, or a place at King's College, Cambridge to study if I'm absolutely hopeless at studying and have no talent. Yet, in much of our life, money holds us to ransom. It slips through our hands in a slithery kind of way. The more we have, the more we seem to need. And indeed, our lives are propelled by the need for money. There always seems to be a shortage of this commodity, as you may have noticed. This is created by the desire for the substance itself. It seems, in a sense, to turn to dust in our hands. When the more we have, the more we seem to need. In comparison with most of the world, we are affluent or rich in Britain or America. Our world is awash with the things that money can buy, yet few of us feel satisfied. At the other extreme, there are simpler societies which people wander around in forests and savannas and across the mountains. They appear to have hardly anything at all, yet it's reported that they feel much more satisfied with their economic wealth. How is that so? Well, the paradox arises from the fact that satisfaction comes from not things in themselves, but the relation between those things and what we hope out of life, between our means and our ends, between our income and our expenditure. This was pointed out by the anthropologist, forcefully by the anthropologist Marshall Salins in his article on the original affluent society. But it was put in another way by Charles Dickens in his novel David Copperfield, when he made Mr. Micawber say, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19.19.6. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 naught and 6. Result, misery. It's the relation between means and ends and income and expenditure that's important. Some simple hunting and gathering societies had a finite need for food and water, for shelter and clothing, and for leisure and social relationships. There is more than enough of these for most people. Income in harvesting nature exceeds demand. We, on the other hand, often reach for the stars, have an open-ended demand and a deep craving for more and more. We have a nice consumer, durable, a decent television set, then we see someone else has an even better television set or DVD player or computer or whatever it is, or someone's living in a better house or with a better car, and we seem to itch for more. And of course our advertising pressures play on this. Very soon we forget that what made us happy yesterday would not satisfy us for a moment today. I'll give you an example. I met a Chinese man in his 30s. He said that as a country boy, all he wished for in life was one day to be rich enough to have boiled dumplings every morning, like his city cousins who he had visited. Now his daughter is his age, as he was then, and she wants a PhD from Beijing University. This is the revolution of rising expectations, which condemns many of us to eternal dissatisfaction. And Buddhism calls understanding this the second noble truth. So each choice is a minor deprivation. At the restaurant of life, we can only gorge ourselves on a certain amount. If we choose the curry, we have to forego the pizza or the stew. And so you can only eat a certain amount. The Romans tried to overcome this, of course, by making themselves artificially sick and then having another course, but in the end even they were exhausted. We always want more. Happiness is seen as lying in the future, in some future bonus or better job. Yet we are constantly brainwashed to think that money really exists and that the more of it we have, the happier we will be. The whole capitalist consumption system wouldn't really work very well unless we are persuaded to spend, spend, spend. The billboards, the television advertisements, the lifestyles of media and sports heroes constantly shout money, money, money to us. It's therefore sensible from time to time to stand back from this and just to take a piece of money and try eating it, taste it in our mouth. Unless it's tea or pepper or something like that, it won't taste of anything. Or, as the Irish philosophically put it, a shroud has no pockets. After this life you can't take it with you. And so, in the end, if you think about your life, one very useful piece of advice is from the great economist Adam Smith, who says that if we want to escape from the trap of anxiety and dependency on money, the best thing is to think about spending less rather than trying to earn more. That's the much more safe way of proceeding. For though we can never earn enough to satisfy our ever-expanding cravings, through frugality we can learn the pleasure of being free from care. We certainly need sufficient money in the present world. As the comedian Woody Allen observed, money is better than poverty, if only for financial reasons. But if you have just enough and are just a little bit over, as with time, then you will be happy. And it will give you the opportunity to spread it around a bit, because one of the great joys of life, I've certainly found later on in my life, is giving rather than accumulating. Or as the Francis Bacon, the philosopher, put it, money is like muck or manure, not good unless it be spread. So moving on from money to consumption more generally, why is consumption so important? Well, it affects everything, and indeed it's in many ways the basis of economics as well, and was really recognized to be such from very early on. For example, Adam Smith said, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. You produce in order to consume, certainly in capitalist societies. And as the sociologist Daniel Bell put it, the cultural transformation of modern society is due singularly to the rise of mass consumption. Consumption is what much of our lives is about. We are consuming machines. John Berger, the sociologist, puts it, publicity throws consumption into a substitute for democracy. The choice of what one eats or wears or drives takes the place of significant political choice. In many ways, most people spend much, much more time thinking about consuming than about democracy or political ideals or almost anything else in their lives. So it's pretty important to know something about it or think about it a bit. So what do we consume? Well, many, many things. And again, you have to get away from the fetishism, so to speak, of thinking of it as physical things. You consume all sorts of things from air and water, up and down. Consumption is not to be confused with consumerism. It's something which goes much more than just consumerism. It includes time spent on doing things, for example, singing, dancing, praying, watching television, as well as actual objects. So it's as wide as culture itself. We consume relationships, we consume people. Almost everything looked at from one point of view in modern society can be seen of in terms of consumption. If consumption, Chris Hand says, is to be defined in terms of the pleasurable realization of identity, then in our kind of society we should recognize that work must, for some lucky people, be seen as a consumption good. So having work, having meaningful work, is another form of consumption. Now, consumption has become so important in our society that in many ways we are going through a transformation back to what was the major way of differentiating society in early societies, which is based on consumption, on status groups, on what you consume rather than what you produce. Classes, as we saw earlier, are stratified according to their relationship to the production and acquisition of goods, relationship to the means of production, whereas status groups are stratified according to the principles of their consumption of goods, as represented by styles of life, as Max Weber put it. And we are in many ways moving back to differentiations in our societies being based on styles of life rather than what we particularly own. For instance, and a good example of the backwards and forwards here is to be found in China. It's gone through three great shifts. For hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, it was a consuming-based societies. The traditional high consumption of the court and of the mandarins was famous. You consumed literacy, literate things, aesthetics, art, poetry, gardens, and so on and so on. And then the peasants consumed other things, and that's what divided society. Then you got the Cultural Revolution and the radical attempt to make an egalitarian society, which was extended to everything, including work. The intellectuals were sent off into the countryside to do manual labor and so on under Chairman Mao. And it was a period when you tried to enforce equality in consumption. So everyone had the same style of clothes, everyone wore blue, men and women wore the same clothes, everyone ate more or less the same sort of things. And as we know, in many ways it was deeply unsatisfying, even if people did feel much more equal. Now, if you visit China, as I've done recently several times, you find a booming consumer culture with lifestyles differentiating people in the big cities from remote parts of the countryside on a huge scale. So it's moved back to a consumption-based differences. In such societies, traditionally, where everything was based on consumption, you would try and, as it were, put up protection against the erosion of the differences by what were known as sumptuary laws, laws which prevented people who were from certain backgrounds parading themselves in the wrong consumption styles. So, for instance, ordinary peasants were not allowed to wear fancy clothes and eat fancy things, and you could be prosecuted for breaking these rules. This isn't something which we have legally, but of course we police the differences through jokes and through snobbery and through other things. Western societies, until recently anyway, went through a stage where there were consumption classes. And Mary Douglas, for instance, and Baron Isherwood have written about this and seen how this works in the book on the world of goods. And they differentiate three consumption classes. The lowest consumption class spend a high proportion of their income on foodstuffs and the material things of life and just trying to survive. In the middle class is a consumption class of people for whom status competition, and I'm quoting, through the acquisition of relatively expensive consumer durables was a major preoccupation. The middle classes are ones who are trying to keep up with each other through the purchase of cars, televisions, nice homes, gardens, and so on. The higher class, the top of the elite, was that comprising people for whom time and information were the most precious commodities. Their houses weren't necessarily full of DVD players, and the cars weren't necessarily huge and ostentatious, but they knew the right people, they controlled their time, they had high prestige jobs. And so you get different kinds of snobbery and distinction here. And it's been analysed by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu in his book on distinction. Turning to one other aspect of consumption, let's have a look at consumption and globalization, a very fashionable subject. Because one anthropological contribution to this area has been to see how consumption varies and spreads around the globe and is modified as Western consumption patterns meet other traditions and cultures. This is sometimes done through the study of particular consumption goods, for instance tea, coffee, sugar and so on. Sidney Mintz, for instance, has studied the effects of the consumption of sugar on different economies, political systems and cultures, and he showed, for instance, that the demand for sugar in European societies which was influenced by the new industrial system of production in Europe, had wide-ranging effects throughout the world, particularly in the Caribbean and also in Africa, because the sugar trade demanded cheap labour, which was behind with cotton, the slave trade. So consumer item like sugar or cotton changes the patterns of all sorts of people's lives and led to the great slave boom. And other examples are Jack Goody's work on flowers and cooking, where consumption patterns alter and reflect different aspects of society. One I'm particularly interested in and have worked on can be taken as an illustration here briefly, and that is the history of tea as a consumer item. This is a pretty important consumer item. You may not know that more tea is consumed by human beings than any other substance on earth except water and air. And it's a medical plant and a consumer item which has a long history, which has affected many parts of different societies. Over 2,000 years ago it was developed in China as a stimulating and medicinal drink, and by the 8th century it spread all over China and then spread to Japan and began to be used as a currency across Central Asia in the form of brick tea, and helped the development of the Tibetan Empire and so on. It took off in the West from the 1720s, when a direct trade was instituted with China, and by the later 18th century it was being drunk by all classes in Britain. And then it spread elsewhere, and by the early part of the 20th century it dominated many parts of the British Empire, and even spread in India itself, which took to tea drinking in a large way, surprisingly late in the early 20th century. So it spread, and up to a third of the world drinks it. What effects did it have? Well, much of Chinese and Japanese life, of course, has been deeply affected by tea drinking. It influenced their ceramics, the development of important developments in porcelain and chinaware. It influenced their furniture, their architecture, their gardening, their literature. It led in the same way in the West to the development of pottery and porcelain in 18th century Britain. It affected garden design in the West as in the East. It affected social classes, gender relations. It gave a new role for women in the West. It changed the time of meals and the nature of meals. Breakfast changed in the 18th century in Britain. The evening meal got later because you had a tea in between. It led to the development of clubs and recreations. It helped in the marketing revolution. It created the first large-scale global market and consumer societies in the West. It was the foundation of the wealth of the East India Company, and hence of the British wealth in India, which helped them absorb India, and it generated much of the energy and concentration which was necessary in the Industrial Revolution. So it also had significant effects, I would argue, on health and the decline of dysentery and waterborne diseases through the boiling of tea and the phenolics in the tea. So it affects politics, religion, art, aesthetics, medicine, everything. And this is just one of many plants. So consumption, we are what we consume to a large extent, and our societies reflect our consumer needs and then generate new needs. So consumption is extremely important, and it's affected by the last major topic I want to look at, which is technology. So to consider technology, what is it and how does it help? It's obviously something that is very, very important to understand in our world, because our world is heavily, heavily driven by rapid changes in technology, and it surrounds us and we are swamped by it, and much of the consumerism I've been talking about is linked obviously to the wealth that new technologies can produce, and much of our lives and even our concepts of ourselves as individuals is shaped by new technologies. What is special about human beings is that more than any other animal, they can transfer what they learn about things out of their individual brains into the external world. They can store and transmit ideas through an elaborate cultural system, and this makes knowledge grow quite quickly. It isn't just repeated behavior. This essential skill of human beings, their culture, can be either immaterial, that is, it doesn't have a material form or body, such as language, songs, myths, traditions, or material, writing, physical tools, rituals, and ways of thinking. And part of this world is technology, and in fact technology bridges these two, because it is a combination of both immaterial and material. So our knowledge gets embedded outside ourselves in tools which in turn help us to think better. It's a kind of triangular movement. There's an increase in our understanding of the world, reliable knowledge about the world. This is the first and top point of the triangle, that an idea that Jerry Martin and I developed. Then it goes round to become implemented in new innovations and inventions after the disinterested researcher has found it out. These are physical artifacts or tools or other things like that. These are then the second point of the triangle. Then they go across and they become disseminated in huge quantities. You invent a Sony Walkman and you make millions of Sony Walkmans, and that goes round to the third part of the triangle. Or you invent a new kind of computing system, and that then leads to millions of new computers of that kind, which help people then to discover new things. So it goes back up to the top of the triangle and you go around like this. This triangular motion has occurred in many spheres of life and is increased by something else which is important to understand about technologies, which is that as they become more powerful and sophisticated, there is an increasing rate at which they develop. There's what you might call the Meccano effect, after the famous children's game Meccano. That is to say, if you add a new piece, you already have certain kinds of pieces, and then you add a new piece like a wheel. That doesn't just add one more new piece, it alters all the previous pieces. So you have an exponential or non-linear growth in the power of technologies. And this is what explains why, for instance, computing power is doubling every 18 months according to Moore's law, or you get very rapid growth in technologies such as printing or clocks or glass or photography, because of these effects. The knowledge goes back and round the triangle and gets faster and faster. So this explains the rapid onrush, the amazing onrush of technologies in the last 300 years. I want to take just again one example from my own work, which is on the history of glass and its impact in the world. It's an excellent example because glass is in many ways the most powerful of all technologies, in the sense that it, as these glasses show, I wouldn't be able to give this talk without these glasses, because I wouldn't be able to read the script in front of me. And so glass is the one tool that humans have developed which actually alter our most fundamental and most powerful sense organ, our eyes, which are directly linked to our brain. So glass is the ultimate and greatest thinking tool. Just looking very briefly at the history of glass manufacturing, it's obviously a very old substance, but it began to be obvious from about the 9th century to Islamic scholars that you could use it to discover new things. It wasn't just something to beautify drinks or to keep out the cold wind or whatever. It was something which you could use to help think with. And this idea spread from Islamic societies into Europe, and in the 13th century became the basis of the leading science at the time, optics. And the manipulation of vision and optics, which led into geometry and mathematics and altered all sorts of things, developed faster and faster. So you begin to get more theoretical knowledge in these fields, but this is then implemented in practical tools for discovery. For example, the idea that you could put two bits of glass beside each other and you could magnify things or diminish things. You could see long distances or see down tiny items, the telescope and the microscope. That developed, and without those things, of course, much of our modern world couldn't have developed. Without the telescope, Galileo couldn't have done his, or proved some of his fundamental theories. Without the microscope, the world of bacteria couldn't have been developed. But there were other ways in which glass helped science and knowledge. For instance, you needed a glass receptacle to prove the existence of a vacuum, and without the vacuum that Boyle discovered, much of modern chemistry and physics couldn't have proceeded. So for much of chemistry you need glass retorts, flasks, thermometers, barometers, and so on. So nowadays almost all sciences depend on glass in some way. Without glass you couldn't have had the discovery of electricity, of watches, of you couldn't have televisions working. Glass is everywhere. It's ubiquitous, so ubiquitous that we hardly notice it as we look around us. But it didn't just change these direct scientific discoveries, but it also changed the way people perceived and thought of the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that it was at the time of the rapid development of good glass windows and good glass instruments that you had a sudden breakthrough in the way the world was perceived, which we call the Renaissance, a new sense of perspective. Indeed, many of the great Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci said that the mirror is the master of painters, that mirrors are absolutely essential for painting, and the discovery of perspective was linked to the use of a mirror by Brunelleschi. So not only in sciences but in arts also you have enormous impact of what appears to be just a neutral technology. And it also ultimately gives human beings a sense of confidence. Much of life is about how much confidence you have, and the confidence which was induced by having a technology which allowed you to discover new things which the Romans and your predecessors hadn't known about, tiny things, faraway things, gave people curiosity, fed their curiosity, and gave them confidence to move on. So again, glass is a very good example of better theoretical knowledge instituted in particular technology, then multiplied hugely, and then going back into theory. But its history is also interesting because it shows that technologies don't automatically develop as we sometimes think. We think we are bound to have progress in this way. In fact, the great glass is a great example of how this isn't so, because glass was widely known, glass blowing was widely known right through the whole of European Asian continent as far as Japan by the 7th, 8th centuries, and yet in China and Japan it faded away for various reasons. It wasn't particularly useful. They had a hot drink, tea, which was best drunk in the fine porcelains and potteries of those areas. There were earthquakes in Japan, so you didn't want glass windows, and so on. A number of practical reasons. Glass was not a big deal, and it more or less disappeared. Indeed, entirely disappeared in Japan, so that when the Portuguese arrived with bits of glass, the Japanese didn't know what it was. They thought it must have been dug out of the ground, because they'd lost the memory of glass, which they'd had quite considerably. So it's a good example of losing a technology. But without glass, it's very difficult to see how the scientific revolution which occurred in the West could have ever occurred in China and Japan. So and likewise the development of spectacles, which was so important in the West for correcting for long-sightedness in later life like mine, was very different in its history in the East and the West. So technologies shape our lives, and we just have to think for a moment, just think through your day for a moment, and you'll see how much you are shaped by technologies and how much of our strain, stress, and also pleasures of our life are dictated by the development of technologies. So a few final thoughts to round off this set of talks. Thinking in terms of what economic anthropology really is about, there's a fundamental difficulty here, and that is that there is really no such thing. The first lesson of anthropology is that you can't divide parts of our lives into separate boxes, so to speak. Most societies don't think of the economy as an instituted process, of religion as separate off from society, of politics as separate off from religion, and so on. All these things are mixed together. We artificially pretend that you can separate these off, but we know in our heart of hearts that they are all deeply interconnected. And so you can not only not separate off economics from other things, which is a basic anthropological method, but you can't really separate off human beings from things. We are not just bodies, but we are also living through the things we create. So you can talk about the social life of things. Things also have a social life and a mental life. So you can't separate the material, the immaterial, the body, the non-body, the economic from the non-economic. So to begin to understand economic anthropology, you have to, in some ways, unlearn many of the divisions that we take for granted in our society, the gross distortions, as Karl Marx, for example, thought that capitalism creates by fetishizing property and other things. We have to stand right back, and that's why it's helpful to look at the long history of man when considering economic related matters. Our own world is very, very peculiar, both in its technology and its assumptions and so on. It may be very widespread because it's now ruling the earth, so to speak, but it's only a couple of 100 years at the most, and in many parts of the world only the last 50 years that the capitalist industrial kind of assumptions have spread. In most societies, and even in our own society, you can't separate off the economy from other things. And indeed, if you look for a moment at our own life, we see that's true. We may think, oh well, the stock exchange or Wall Street, those are an economic institution. But if you watch people in those institutions, if you watch traders and so on, you can see that a lot is going on beyond the economic. The economic is only a very small part of it. And certainly in our own lives, there are very few activities which are purely economic. Even very rich people who I've talked to say that their pursuit of wealth is indirect. They're usually trying to play some other game, and then the money comes along as well. But the money isn't the central obsession. Another general thing you can say is that our world is peculiar in that there is no basic thing that determines everything else. In many societies, you have what Marx would call an infrastructure. You have one part of life which determines other parts of lives. So in most societies that's kinship, who you are related to. In other societies, for instance in Hindu India, it was largely religion and ritual purity. In some societies it's politics. In communism it was largely politics. But modern market capitalist economies really have no infrastructure. You can't say everything is determined by this. If there is anything, of course, it is money and markets, but it doesn't determine everything, as I've tried to show. In some ways, this was best realized by the great sociologist Max Weber, whose work on economy is most fruitful, where he showed that the relations between religion and politics and religion and economics are what is really interesting. In his famous Protestant ethic thesis, he saw the way in which changes in religion both reflected and caused changes in economic behavior. He argued that there was a great change in our world towards what he described or is known as the Protestant ethic. That is, an ethical system which is half religious, half economic, also social and so on, where you construct a new kind of world, an unbounded, open, restless, anxious, never to be satisfied kind of world, the world I've described earlier as the opposite of original affluent society. At the heart of this, of course, in his formulation, is the famous paradox. In the closed worlds in most societies, either you're predestined to heaven or to hell. You are fixed in your social position from birth. There's nothing you can do about it. Your status is fixed and is ascribed rather than achieved. In the modern world, all this seems to have changed, and curiously this was affected by a paradox, by Calvinism, he argues. That is to say, the idea of predestination in Calvinism was put very simply that basically you were damned or saved at birth. There was nothing you could do about it. You couldn't earn your way to heaven, as the Catholics argued, by works. You were saved or damned. Now this, you would think, fitted in with the idea of birth-given status. But in fact, of course, you never know whether you're damned or saved. And so your whole life, since damnation is so awful, is trying to prove to yourself and maybe to others that you are actually saved. And you do this by doing the sort of things that saved people do. You are very pious, you help people, you work hard, and so on. And so, in fact, you work even harder to prove to yourself that you're saved, even though there's nothing much you can do about it. That's the great paradox. And you therefore pursue godly things. You are careful with your time, your money, you're rational, and so on. And much of the wealth of the modern world came out of that new attitude. Now, of course, you can throw all sorts of things at this theory, and many people have. There are many weaknesses of it as a over simple generalization or connection. For instance, in Scotland, which was Calvinist, it wasn't a very great wealth-producing society early on, and so on. But Weber's work is much more subtle than that. He just said that there was a relationship between ethics and economy, and there certainly does seem to be. But one of the lessons of this is, as I've constantly stressed, is that by putting up a mirror to our own lives, the economic systems and the embedded systems of other societies show how much of our own lives are not really to do directly with the economy. Friendship, sport, love, art, pleasure, gardening, all these things are in many ways on the borderlines of the economy. And therefore we don't want to become too obsessed with money, although, as Woody Allen said, it's a good idea to keep it in mind. That's the end.